President Biden has issued a mass pardon, one of the largest mass pardons in American history. And this has to do with people who were convicted of simple marijuana possession in federal court or in court in the District of Columbia. Now, there are some people saying, oh, this is, a pre-election day stunt, try to get votes. But also, I think it speaks to what really is some growing momentum around just the legalization of marijuana federally in the United States of America. And there's this woman I follow on social media who I'd never spoken to before, but she is get this, the federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico. Her name is Natalie Fertig. And so I reached out to her and said, I can't think of anyone better to bring on the show to talk about this than you, because that is an awesome job title, the Federal Cannabis Policy Reporter for Politico. So she and I talked about the implications of this mass pardon and what might be coming next for weed in this country. Natalie, welcome to Undivided with the person with the coolest job title in journalism. I love it. How'd you land that gig, that assignment?
Oh, well, thanks for having me. So I was I was covering cannabis actually as one of many policy issues at an earlier job, and Politico needed someone to focus just on cannabis policy and hired me on to do it. And it's been a wild ride, definitely, for the past few years.
And when did you start in this assignment?
At Politico, just over 3 years ago.
3 years ago. So in all the stories you've covered on cannabis, where does the mass pardon that the president just put down sort of rate?
The mass pardon, there's two parts about the president's recent announcement. The mass pardon is a big deal because it's a big step by a federal entity, by the executive branch. But I would actually say that the review process that the president just started with HHS and the DOJ to maybe potentially reschedule cannabis is actually the bigger part of the announcement that came out this week. Most people who are in prison for possession of marijuana are not in federal prison. They're in state prisons and local jails. So there's only, I think the White House said 6,500 people that this will affect. Most, if not all of those people, are not currently in prison. The United States federal government has deprioritized arresting people for marijuana possession in recent years, especially since states have begun to legalize it. But the president asked governors to follow his footsteps. So it's a big sort of philosophical step to do those pardons. And then the review process could potentially end in complete descheduling of marijuana in the next couple of years.
And I was kind of curious what the fallout from that would be, because you don't really go to prison for simple marijuana possession. I mean, that's traditionally not something that you're going to do hard time for at the federal level or the state level. So if you had the rescheduling that happened, because right now it's a Scheduled I controlled substance, how do you think that would impact people who are, say, in state prison or even federal prison for trafficking marijuana?
Yeah, so I will say that the line between simple possession and trafficking is very different in every state. So there's certain amounts that you might be able to possess. Washington State, for example, has marijuana that's legal up to a couple ounces. Above that, it does technically become illegal. But then, if you had, say, a pound, is that trafficking? Is that not trafficking? Is that I grew it in my yard and I grew more than the government told me to? So there's sort of this gray area before you get up into the hundreds of pounds, which I think is what we all think of when we think of cartels and trafficking. And so in states like Mississippi, there are still a lot of people in state prison for marijuana possession. It's not a joint, but it's maybe not that hundreds of pounds of cartels. So you've got a gray area in there, and all of those people would be affected. Mississippi has the right to decide whether those people are pardoned if they were to legalize recreational marijuana in their state, that those people could have that on their record forever. That's a Mississippi decision, right? So what the impact would be of descheduling, federal descheduling, would be moving forward. So people may, the biggest impacts really would be for state markets. Washington State, again, I keep mentioning it because that's where I'm from, has a legal market, but they cannot take any of the cannabis in that market and sell it in another legal state like Oregon or in California. So it would open up the borders of states where cannabis is legal and where cannabis is illegal. It would also make the possession of marijuana legal in all states. You couldn't necessarily buy it. There's still dry counties where you can't buy alcohol in places like Minnesota and Mississippi still. So that could stay for decades, honestly. But you would no longer be arrested for having a joint, even in a state that had not legalized the sale of marijuana.
As you've covered this issue, what are some of the arguments against rescheduling it? Because right now it's like with heroin and bath salts and things that I guess, don't even put in the same universe as weed. So what do you hear from some lawmakers or policymakers about why they don't want it rescheduled?
I think we see a really big generational difference when you look at lawmakers' perceptions of marijuana, especially people who grew up during the Reagan era of just saying no to drugs. I think millennials, especially, are the first generation that really have a different perception of drugs than, say, boomers. And you still have a lot of lawmakers who are from the older generation. When you get younger lawmakers, you've got them on both sides of the aisle who are for decriminalizing marijuana at the federal level. I mean, you've got Republicans like Nancy Mace and Matt Gaetz who are pro legalization. You've got older Democrats who shy away from it and don't want to talk about it and are not supportive of it. So there's a more generational difference. And I think that that's still playing a really big role in why Congress has not moved on this. As far as the arguments against rescheduling, it's mostly due to barriers to research. The president's announcement this week specifically said that that HHS and the DOJ are supposed to look at all currently available research, which means that the process will probably go faster because the government could just research and research and research until like our eyes run, right? to figure out, what really the wide impacts of people using marijuana are. We're still doing this with the impacts of tobacco, the impacts of alcohol. I mean, it seems like every week there's a new study saying you should drink a glass of wine, you shouldn't drink a glass of wine. We could do that till the cows come home for marijuana as well. But the president said use the available research that has been done, that has been approved by the FDA, and they're going to go in and they're going to look at that research. It's probably going to take a year or two at the fastest to look at this research and say it should be, there's 5 schedules, it should be here, or it should not be a scheduled drug at all. It's really unclear what that process will come to in the end. It's supposed to be a scientific process, but if science were reigning, alcohol would probably be a scheduled drug because you can abuse alcohol. Caffeine might be a scheduled drug, to be completely clear, because people have dependencies on caffeine. So ultimately, it will be a political decision.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not of the belief that marijuana has can have no consequences on someone's life. I mean, I had some pretty lazy college roommates that I don't know if I would want them doing anything when they were high. But does it seem like it's just sort of a matter of time? Because correct me if my numbers are wrong, but I think there's 19 states where recreational use is legal. Is that correct? And then there's some more that have decriminalized.
Yes, there are some that have decriminalized, and some cities also in certain states that have decriminalized. Like, for instance, Nashville is decriminalized in a state that has not legalized yet. And then you've got 37 states that have medical marijuana of some sort. So.
And then I know there's a handful of states that are going to vote on legalization on November 8th. So I guess for you, when do you think this is sort of the pendulum swings? I mean, if you've got the majority of the states in the union where recreational weed is legal, I guess how can they keep it illegal at a federal level?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, after this election, we could have 24 of 50 states that have legal recreational marijuana. The thing is that the more states, in some ways, the more states that legalize marijuana, the more complicated this gets, because every state legalizes in a slightly different way. And because there is no interstate commerce right now, every state has to build a cannabis industry from the ground up. So you're encouraging and enticing people to put money into cannabis farms and cannabis grows in places that cannabis does not grow as naturally as it does in maybe Southern Oregon or Northern California. And when the boundaries suddenly lift, you're going to have people going out of business. So the more states that have a stake in this, the more that they're going to be very specific about how federal legalization happens. And we know that the more specific Congress has to be, the more interests that are involved, the slower and the harder it is to get anything done in Congress. Yeah, so it's going to be.
You mentioned some of the bipartisan support for federal legalization. There's been some bipartisan efforts out of Washington State. We've had some challenges with public safety as it relates to pot shops being the victims of brutal and in some cases deadly robberies because they've got all this cash and they can't participate in the banking system in the same way a traditional business can. What kind of, if we're waiting 2 years, for instance, for a decision to be made on rescheduling, what's being done in the meantime to try to legitimize these businesses, at least enough to try to keep them safe?
Right. Well, there's actually a bill in the Senate right now. It's passed the House, I believe, 7 times at this point, which is a bit insane. But the Senate is genuinely considering a bill called the Safe Banking Act that would make it more possible for banks to serve businesses in the cannabis industry. The big worry on the bank's end is money laundering. And so a lot of them don't want to offer checking accounts or small business loans to cannabis businesses because they don't want to have to be the ones policing those businesses. So this bill would kind of free them of that worry. It's not going to be like the perfect solution. We're probably not going to see like JP Morgan Chase start to bank cannabis businesses, but a lot of smaller banks, credit unions would have more ability to do it, to offer banking services to the cannabis industry. And that bill might pass during the lame duck session this year. Democrats are going to want to get it over the finish line, especially if they lose one or both chambers of Congress in the November election, which it definitely seems like Republicans are more likely to take the House than Democrats are to keep it at this point. And that means they're going to want to get something done because while there is Republican support for this bill, there is not a lot of Republican leadership support for this bill. So Republican leaders would not be likely to take it up in either chamber if they won control of either chamber. So we might see that happen. We might see it move like as part of another bill. They might add some other smaller things to the bill to help the cannabis industry, make it more legitimate, ensure also that business owners of color that are already facing their own issues within the banking industry, systemic issues of racism in the banking industry, will not then meet those when banks offer services to the cannabis industry. So that might be part of that bill. And that would be a small help, but it's not gonna solve everything that, say, decriminalization would.
Can you elaborate on that? With it, do you mean that like BIPOC business owners aren't getting loans from banks or?
Well, one of the things that I've seen in my couple of years of covering the cannabis industry is states like Massachusetts that come out and say, hey, we're going to offer a certain type of licenses specifically for people who've been impacted by the war on drugs. The thing is that if you've been impacted on the war on drugs, for example, if you have a criminal record, you've also had a really hard time getting other types of employment since you maybe served that jail time. So you don't have the like financial backing that a bank might want to see in order to give you a small business loan. You may not have the financial track record. You may have had to be cobbling together other jobs in the 10 years since you served time in order to be paying your rent, be paying your food. And you can't walk in with this big portfolio that maybe somebody who, has worked in real estate for 15 years is able to walk in and say, look, I have this history of owning businesses. And so how do you, support those people? How do you get around those issues if you really are choosing these people to try to help get ahead in this industry? You're saying we're legalizing something and we want to go back and help people who may have gone to prison for that thing. We want to make it so that they can actually, be a small business owner in this industry. But then there's so many other layers of things that you need to start a small business in this country that oftentimes people who are Black and brown, also women, also veterans, tend to be a couple steps further down that checklist of getting the good financing for a small business, getting that license, that competitive license in a from like a city council. Those types of things are harder to come by if you have those marks against you already. So there's talk about how if we're opening up banking to the cannabis industry, how do we also make sure that those loans and those things are going out to these people who have been impacted by the lack of legalization of cannabis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. A couple more things. Of course, there's always going to be criticism of things that the president does, especially a month ahead of a critical election. Some people have said that he's just buying votes by with this. Is there any truth to that? Could this be the president just trying to win some votes for his team?
I mean, every politician is just trying to win votes. That's why that's the name of the whole game, right? Voting the election is your twice annual HR review. It's where the voters come in and say, we like the things that you did. And right before your HR review, you might try to do a couple things that make your boss happy with you versus going into your HR review in a bad place with your workplace, right? President's just trying to do the exact same thing. What's interesting is that he chose, to me, as someone who's been covering cannabis for 3 years and knows Biden's track record on cannabis, which is that he is not wildly supportive, that he chose this as his issue to be what we in DC call the October surprise. There's always something that they roll out in October right before the midterms. Every party does this. Every politician does this. Whoever it is that's in charge, to say, hey, look, this is a good reason to vote for us. Cannabis is not something that I've been seeing a lot of politicians leaning into in this election. It had a lot more focus in the last election because, post George Floyd, like a lot of criminal justice issues were a really big focus in the last election. And in this election, frankly, policing and violence is a big issue. And so a lot of politicians have strayed away from marijuana, which is still sort of a gray area for some people when it comes to legality and criminal justice and policing and violence. And, you think drugs, you think bad and violence, right? So it's just been something that politicians are staying away from more in this election. And it's really fascinating to see the president of the United States, who has had drug issues in his own family. So marijuana is something that he has not jumped on the bandwagon. He was the only presidential candidate in 2020 to not say, I want to broadly legalize marijuana. That he's seeing, I can only assume, polling data, which some recent polls show that younger voters particularly are motivated by the idea of cannabis legalization, especially in states where it is not yet legal, like in the South and the Midwest. Democrats are looking for ways to pull younger voters out to the polls. And the president would not do this if he thought that it would hurt Democrats. So I think it just says some really interesting things about what politicians are seeing with cannabis policy in the United States and what they're saying, essentially what the voters want and what they're seeing from their polling and their data that voters are saying they want.
You're right that it would seem contradictory, because I think crime, as you mentioned, and violence is going to be one of the biggest issues, especially for, as a moderate, it's one of the issues that I'm prioritizing at the top, just behind the economy. And so you wouldn't immediately think like, let's legalize a drug, although I don't associate weed with like violent crime. I mean, you could associate it with cartel violence and stuff. So I know there's a lot of it wrapped up. So to me, it is kind of like a little bit of a gamble. I mean, he must have seen some polling, but for folks who, don't feel so strongly about marijuana legalization, they might look at that and say, well, that's an odd thing to do, and there's a crime crisis. One more question for you, Natalie. I do worry about, and I don't know the answer to this, but kind of how federal legalization would impact drug cartel and the smuggling of narcotics into our country. And, feel free to just tell me I'm just wrong and it makes no sense. But I guess one of the things I worry about is, if it doesn't make sense for the cartel to bring weed into the country anymore, if it's legalized, that we're going to see an influx, even more so, of actual deadly drugs. Fentanyl has been pouring in. And so I guess that's one of my concerns is, are they going to focus their attention on things that are much more likely to kill Americans?
Well, I would say that they already are. We've seen from Border Patrol numbers that marijuana seizures at the border have dramatically decreased over the last decade as states have legalized marijuana. And we also know that cartels are growing marijuana in the United States and then shipping it to other parts of the United States. You know, as marijuana becomes more available, the price does go down, and you save a lot of transportation costs to grow something closer to the people you're selling it to. So I believe the numbers are, I'm rattling this off the top of my head, but $34 million or 34 million pounds of marijuana is expected to be sold illegally in the United States this year. I believe around 23 million of that is coming from Oregon and California. So, and then some of that's coming from New York to sell to New Yorkers and vice versa, you know, but a lot of the marijuana that's sold illegally in the United States is being grown within the United States, not in Mexico anymore. It's just not really part of the game. But yes, cartels are going to find something else to bring into the country. Americans use drugs. It's just a fact of life. It has been for the last 100 years. You know, you can go all the way back to opium. It's something that is going to be an issue, and legalizing marijuana, from all of the experts that I talk to, is not going to immediately stop the international drug trade. Because actually, in many ways, we're producing the majority of marijuana now that goes around the world. So, yeah.
I like the simplification of that. We use drugs. Americans use drugs, or they wouldn't be bringing it in.
It's going to be an ongoing battle, right? I've talked to law enforcement. They're like, you get one drug under control, and then there's a new one. You know, it's a different conversation that is a very important conversation. You know, Americans are being very much hurt by the drugs that are coming across the border, but I've never had a law enforcement expert tell me that legalizing one of them, or even getting rid of the use of one of them, is going to get rid of drug cartels. It's just going to find something else to bring across the border.
Yeah. Well, Natalie Fertig with Politico, we appreciate your expertise on this issue. And you said you're from Washington. Where?
Yeah, I'm from a small town called Hawkinson. It's in Clark County. It's like nestled in the foothills of the Cascades.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Well, I'm sure there's some folks who'll be watching this who are from there, and they'll send me an email explaining where it is, because I do know where Clark County is, but I don't know where that is. So, Natalie, we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
If you've not become a subscriber to Undivided already, there are 2 ways you can do that, and it's as little as $5 a month. So if you think that what we're doing is important, if you find value in it, if you appreciate what we're doing to hold elected leaders accountable and to look at things through the lens of common sense, I would appreciate it if you'd become a paid subscriber to the show. That's how we're funded. This is a people-powered podcast, and you can do it for just $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided. That's patreon.com/undivided. Or you can become a contributor on my locals community, brandykruse.locals.com. Undivided is presented by our founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.